Chapter Happy Hour. My name is Will Clayton. I'm a senior regional representative based out of Minnesota. And joining me tonight on the only Chapter Happy Hour of October is Matt O'Connor. Matt is the Habitat Teams Coordinator for Habitat Forever. Thanks for joining me, Matt.
Yeah, good to be here, Will. Kind of had a little bit of a discussion to start this off on. I'd gotten called to have this meeting in April, or to give the chat here in April, and I said no, I wanted to do it now because all those folks that are online that are listening, I think, realize that now's the time to be getting ready for spring burning or fall burning or whatever you might be doing. But this is a good time to get ready. Everybody here probably gets phone calls in April, and those kind of stink because it's last minute stuff, and we like to get planning a little farther ahead than that when it comes to prescribed fire.
Well, good.
I'm glad everybody could come.
Yeah, me too. So before we get into the meat of the conversation, let's, we've got mostly chapter leaders in the room tonight. And like I mentioned early on when we were just chit-chatting, these are folks from all across the country. So I'm not able to see where everybody's from, but certainly a smattering all across the upper Midwest and the far reaches of the United States, but they may not know you. So how long have you been with the organization? Kind of what's your career path been? And what does it mean to be the Habitat Team Coordinator?
I've been with Pheasants Forever since 1990. So it's about 31, 32 years. March 1st, I think, is my 32nd year. But I started as a regional biologist in North Iowa, and actually kind of got hired, when we were that was one of the first ones where we had 2 in one state. And I was actually hired kind of as a habitat specialist as we were kind of searching for names. We had a lot of things going on, and we wanted to, have somebody out there talking habitat to our chapters and a little more touches with them. I did that for 15 years. Whoa. And then I became director of Habitat Forever. Mm-hmm. Interesting enough, Habitat Forever is no longer. And just as we reorganized over the last year, Habitat Forever is still a part of LLC, still, it's still Pheasants Forever, but we're just going to do away with the Habitat Forever LLC and be Pheasants Forever. And all the things that came with COVID was also a time to reorganize and look at our structure. And we just realized that it was really some of the reasons that we did that to begin with are not necessarily as important now. And we knew that we could just kind of bring us back into the fold with everybody else.
Certainly. So we've still got folks out there on the ground doing the work, right? That was sort of the mantra of the Habitat.
I tried to think back a little bit today, Will, and I think I had chapters burning in 1990. We were in a heck of a lot of paragraphs out there on CRP at that time, but there were people out active and burning switchgrass or burning some of those first 3 grass mixes that back then we thought was high diversity.
Yeah.
And they've always been involved because it's been a need for it. And at one point, I think one year, just within Habitat Forever, we burnt somewhere in the neighborhood of 35,000 acres in 1 year. A lot of that just CRP maintenance burns on CRP. But as the years went by, people became more well-trained. As we had more requests, we did more complex fires than that. Yeah. But primarily, a lot of what chapters have been doing has been working on CRP, mid-contract management or just maintenance burns for CRP.
Yeah, and I would imagine that's sort of what our chapter leaders are still doing. I'm here in eastern Minnesota. I've got a handful of chapters that do have a burn crew and do prescribed burning, and it's mostly mid-contract management for CRP. But we're putting grass on the ground a lot of different ways. So I think this is certainly a timely topic, and I like that you fought for it to be in October instead of April, because you're right, getting ahead of the game. And we'll get into this as we go along. It's important to be prepared for a burn in the spring.
So I might just yak here for a while, Will, and if anybody's got questions, you just tell me if there's a question up. We can answer questions in between there, but a little bit more kind of about the history. it was a little bit of the Wild West back there when we first started burning. And the biggest problem was the lack of ability for training and for people to get certified, you know, to be able to do fire, or at least be certified and be able to do it. We gave a lot of programs back in the early years where Habitat Forever put together S-130 and 190 classes, 290 classes, things like that, to help chapter people get some training. As you can imagine, and the people online well know that some of those were 4-day classes to give them effectively and efficiently. And that took a lot of commitment from chapter leaders to go, or chapter people to go and take that kind of time off to get the 130, 190 training, or any of the other trainings that we may have had. There's more of that now, a lot more of it, and it's a little more accessible. Maybe the biggest problem now is people just finding out and digging up where those opportunities are. And now even the NWCG, which is the National Wildland Coordinating Group, you know, is now offering classes online with maybe a day of field training along with it, but it takes a lot of time. It allows somebody to do work online, get most of their training, and then end up just taking a day or a half a day to finish the thing off. So it's a lot less time commitment in the sense of traveling and doing something like that. So that's been a positive part of it. The other thing is, I guess I can consider myself an old timer, and I'll start this off right now to those folks out there that whether they're involved with, you know, seeding or talking to people about natives, you know, the CRP program, our whole native grass program has changed a lot. Our native seedings, what we're seeding for native nesting cover, has changed a lot over the years. And the reason I'm going to bring it up is because our fire and how we use fire on the landscape has changed a lot with it. You know, we had a seed program years ago in Iowa, and I remember when we were innovative, when we had the first 5 grass native seeding, and that was supposedly a neat thing. And, you know, it provided great pheasant habitat, and maybe not at least after 5 or 6 years, the best nesting cover, but still great pheasant habitat. And now we've gone to mixes now where we're planting, you know, 40, 50. So I've got a mix that's got 84, you know, forb seeds in it and 10 or 12 grasses. So we've really come a long way. I tell people now, this is my old timer statement. As we work with native and good native nesting cover, along with good winter cover with it, is that the seeds that we use are kind of the paint that we use to paint that landscape. But the paintbrush is the management afterwards, and the paintbrush is fire. And what I'd like people to understand, we'll talk about a lot of different things tonight, but what I want to talk about is that where we used to, you know, be concerned about, you know, mid-April till mid-May in Iowa to do our burning, you know, now, in fact, we start burning in August, and we'll do some August, early September burns, growing season burns. And then we'll start up again in October and November for fall burns. And then again, the whole thing in the spring might be all the way from the last week of March up until, you know, the perfect thing would be up until about the 3rd week of April, maybe May 1st, depending on weather. But that whole season's changed a lot. That's good from a fire crew because you've got a bigger window to work in. It's not all punched into a month-long period. You've got a lot of different ways. And plus, when it comes to the broadleaves and forbs that we put in our prairies today, if we want to manage for that and not allow it to turn into just a solid stand of grass in the fall, you know, we have to look at different timings for fire. You know, if we want to take care of bluegrass and brome, that's a May 1st burn. If we want to take care of the pollinator seedings and the forbs and broadleaves that are in that prairie, that's got to be earlier than that. You know, in fact, in north central Iowa, you know, May 10th or April 10th, you know, is about your last date when you're really trying to manage for forb diversity in those fires. So
what do you mean by take care of? really quick. Sorry, like, what do you mean by that?
I'm
When you
sorry.
said-
If we're
yeah.
trying to manage to get rid of brome and bluegrass, that's a later fire. If we're trying to manage to keep those forbs vigorous and growing in that fire and actually kind of set back, well, what we're doing by those early birds is maybe setting back some of the big blue stems and switchgrass in those stands. Not set back that we're gonna push them out of the thing, but just so that they don't become so prevalent. That's really an earlier burn that we're looking at. And that's the big sea change out there that, you know, we still don't necessarily have, you know, USDA completely bought into that, but from our standpoint, that's when we're trying to burn now.
Got it. I love that. Seeds are the paint and fire is the paintbrush. That's something I'm going to remember forever. So tonight's topic, I mean, that was a wonderful introduction, of course, like, you know, how this has changed. And as I mentioned, I think our audience is chapter leaders, some of which that might already have a burn program that want to just expand it or learn more. There could be chapter leaders on here that are interested in starting up a fire crew and what does it take to do all that. So obviously fire is a tremendous tool. You hit that on the head. Here in Minnesota, there certainly isn't as much fire on the landscape as there was even, you know, 10 years ago. It's hard to get these things done, but there's a lack of vendors. So there's plenty of chapters that might see that opportunity, you know, this is mission, and it can be done at the local level, which is, I mean, that's Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever to me. So if I'm a chapter and folks are reaching out to me, hey, I know you volunteer for Pheasants Forever. Do you guys do burns? You know, how do they get started? What do they need to do to just carry through this process? And where do they go from there?
Okay. So my job when working with chapters, I don't want to make this sound too smart, like I'm being a smart ass, but my job has been to scare the hell out of them. And I don't mean that in the sense that, you know, I'm out giving every terrible thing that's ever happened. But I just need to make sure that those chapters are really willing and able to do the investment that it takes to really be able to do fire. And what I mean by that is proper equipment. And that's an important thing in our fire manual. And this is sometimes, I apologize, sometimes this has been, I don't want to say misconstrued, but misread. We have a page in there where we talk about this is the equipment that a regular habitat specialist would take out and have with them when they do a prescribed burn. So this is an employee group of a burn crew, and it's pretty over the top for basically you know, our Midwest CRP type burns. But it's important to realize that unless the burn plan states it, or if it's, I've done burn plans literally where I've had it, the equipment needs to be 5-gallon buckets and burlap sacks that you can dip in the thing to be able to put out the backfire. Now, that's not what I want. In that situation where we had that, it was a person that was going to do their own fire. It was only about 20 acres. And you can imagine this is a CRP field where there's green fire break around the entire thing. And then there's a farm road that goes across the upper part of this 20-acre field. And there's a farm road that goes along the lower part of the field. And there's a soybean field on both sides during the year that they were going to burn. And so in that case, they really could handle that fire with a minimum amount of equipment. Some things it might spook you a little bit, but and if you think of where those farm roads are, that's stuff that's either mowed or run over enough so that there's no cover in there. It's down like a, you know, like a lawn almost alongside there. In most cases, the list of equipment that we list in the burn manual is what I'd usually recommend if I was doing a burn plan for anyone. Now, that, and you people that are listening are sure going to be able to comment on this, but here's what I see as a lot of the reality in our Pheasants Forever chapters. Some of the best people that we can have that are available during the day are my age or older, you know, 63, you know, up we've had burn guys on our regular crews that are 70 years old. and they're very effective in fighting fire, but they need a piece of equipment. We can't count on those folks walking. And so I like to say that everybody, there's at least 4 pieces of equipment out there. In best cases, 2 side by side, as like Rangers, Polaris Rangers, and 2 ATVs that one person can sit on. And those units are all equipped with water in one way or another. A pumper in the back of the UTVs and maybe a little bit of water on the back of the ATVs. And so that you've got people that are a little older, but they can maneuver around and be where they need to be on those fires. Then you're going to still talk about a hand crew, depending on the size or the complexity of the fire. Complexity is just how hard the fire might be to control. More hills, more complexity. Taller grass, more complexity. Nice CRP field that's a pollinator field, not too much material in it, not as complex as some of those other ones. But I think a good form of transportation out on those fires is extremely important. And the other one that I didn't mention, it's kind of obvious, is that when we had the case, we'd always have a truck with a pumper unit in the back, whether that was for emergencies or whether we were using that for wet lines. That truck with a bigger pumper unit is important to have. You can get by with a little bit less, but that's something to really think about. I've got one question up there that I'm just going to answer quick. Somebody asked for what would be the perfect time to burn a pollinator in southern Minnesota. And I would say prior to April 10th. And the reason I say that is some of the first forbs that'll come up in the spring, good old black-eyed Susans, the yellow cone flowers, some of those that'll pop up fairly quick are usually out of the ground in early April. And so you'd like to run that fire over that before those first forbs get up. Get that area black, let it warm up, and then let a lot of forbs come up, with or ahead of the warm season grasses that are in that seeding. So I would say earlier the better on that. It could also be a November fire. There's nothing wrong with that. Nobody wants to lose their hunting ground, but that's another time when you can do that.
Perfect. And this is an excellent time. I didn't mention this at the beginning of the hour, but if you have questions, just toss them in the Q&A portion of Zoom, not the chat function. It's really easy for us to answer them, and we'll answer them live if we can get to them. So far there's a pretty tremendous investment here. So this isn't something that chapters just decide for one meeting at the VFW, right? That's a lot of equipment that you listed. So having a partner or, having a concerted plan to acquire that much equipment, that's pretty significant. You've also mentioned a few other things, and early on you mentioned, S130, S190. There's got to be more to it. It's got to be more than just having a couple of Polaris Rangers. What does that training requirement look like? What do chapters need to do to get to you've mentioned burn plans, to get into that mentality as well?
Okay, I'm going to say one more thing about equipment before I forget. Is that what I like to do with my habitat teams that are doing fire, and that would be we might have a single person that's the lead, but they'd hire their own fire crew, and a lot of times those guys come year after year and work on that fire team. I like to buy equipment that is the same. And what I mean by that is that if you buy a pumper unit or make a pumper unit, make them all the same, because we've luckily not had problems with it, but I've seen where there's been problems where something breaks down in the middle of that fire and nobody knows how to fix it, or nobody knows, they know how to fix one, they don't know how to fix the other one. And so when you get equipment, try to make it similar so that you can go over the equipment and make sure people, if they learn how to use one piece of equipment, they can use all the equipment. Now, you were talking about, well, that's the big question that everybody wants to know is, how do you do fire as a chapter and have liability insurance through Pheasants Forever to protect you? Now, we've had this for a long time. It's not really a big thing, but it can be a little bit for people that are working a job and trying to get training done also. But on our fire lines, we figure that a good prescribed fire has 2 people out there, 2 people with a drip torch in their hands. The item, the most important piece of equipment on a fire, and they're the ones lighting the fire and kind of directing the fire and the crews. Those 2 people need to have S-130, S-190 training. That's training that is provided by the NWCG, the National Wildfire Coordinating Group, and each state has fire councils or fire committees or people associated with the state, other NGOs, other private individuals that do fire training and provide fire training in each state. If I'd said this a dozen years ago, I wouldn't be able to say that truthfully. But now everybody's got the ability to get training out there. It's not all going to happen in 1 year. You know, if the guys pop up and say in February and say, here, we're going to burn fire, you know, it might be tough for people to get the training that they need to get so that they're eligible for our liability insurance. But if you look at it in a year-long basis, you can get that done. The nicest thing right now is that S-130 and S-190 are classes that are provided online. And so what that does is that takes a 4-day equipment, a 4-day involvement or, you know, to get that training down to there's some time at night that you're going to do the online work, but I think it's a 6-hour course or a 7-hour course for 1-day field training to get that. So it's a 1-day commitment rather than a 4-day commitment for people. But that's you know, that's the one that everybody gets wound up about and gets worried about. But that's the part of the pie that's really most important. Because if you look at our fire manual, if you look at our fire policy and read it closely, a lot of the other things involved with that fire have to do with what's in the prescribed burn plan. And that would be the next thing, and next most important thing for people to get is whether they can write that burn plan, which most people aren't qualified to do. But if there's state private lands people or people within NRCS or somebody out there who could write those burn plans, what they put in that burn plan is what you need to follow as a chapter fire crew, meaning they'll list the equipment needed to conduct this fire. And you need to have the equipment that does, they'll say how many people that this fire needs to conduct a prescribed fire safely. There's different opinions about that. You know, it's not unusual. When we had a very good fire crew and we had people on ATVs or UTVs and they were well-rounded folks that had done a lot of fire. We've done a lot of fires with 5 people. But there'll be people out there who might write a burn plan and say 8's got to be there, or however many there might be. But you need to follow the burn plan. So a lot of that is depends on what the burn plan says.
So I'm keeping track here. I think it's pretty relevant. It's pretty certain that this isn't going to be something, as I mentioned, that's going to be decided in a meeting. I mean, we've got a lot of equipment that the chapter needs to acquire. I love the tip, the hot tip about, you know, if your pumps make sure they all have Honda motors on them. Make sure you all have Polaris ATVs, right? Like similar equipment. I love that. S-130, S-190, you have to have 2 folks on your chapter or on your burn crew that have that. That's going to take some time as well. And now what I'm hearing is the burn plan, like the chapter or the burn crew associated with the chapter is going to need to build a relationship with someone that can write a burn plan. And so that's not something that a chapter leader could do. Is that correct?
Well, they may be able to do it if they have enough training and can show that training. Okay. You know, we have a lot of chapter leaders that are associated with agencies. Right. Here in Iowa, we have a lot of people associated with county conservation boards that can do that, but you just have to find that person who's equipped to be able to do those burn plans. I got a great question here. This one can come out of left field a little bit, but I like it so much. We got a question here from Nevada, which a hell of a lot different than what we're used to here in the upper Midwest. You know, dry beyond all, you know, all comprehension. And what he's saying is that it's not so much CRP and it's really not so much grass, it's invasives going out on into their grasslands. And you need to sit down with your agencies there and talk to them about it. And here's the reason. I've got a personal experience with it. I went out, we had a habitat specialist for a few years out in Ontario, Oregon, which might not seem like the driest, but they had 9 inches of rain a year. So it was high desert, dry as hell. And I went out there and visited with him one fall, and we went up to hunt chuckers one day, and it was fantastic. And I went back to the site a year later, and it was, the smoke was still rising. It had all burned. The whole huge immense hillsides out there near the Oahe Reservoir, south of Ontario. So I called BLM and said, what happened to the guy? Just happened to get somebody on the phone and got talking to him about it. And I said, boy, you guys ought to be in great shape then in the years to come. And he said, no, take a deep breath. This place could be destroyed because of the fire. So sometimes in those extremely dry climates, you got to be really careful with those fires. I'm thinking, and I don't mean to not answer your question completely, but I would think that timing of a fire in Nevada is going to be so extremely important, because you're going to just pray for there to be, rain to come pretty quick. Because if it shuts off, you could actually destroy the area more than help it. And so I think working with BLM or working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife or Forest Service and finding somebody there who can help you explain that in your local area would be extremely important. So I'm not going to I'm not going to touch the question about when might be the best time to burn. I'd say talk locally to those folks and find out.
That is Josh is from Minnesota. So let's send me an email and we'll cover that off topic. That's a whole other can of worms for us. So we'll take care of that one here internally. No problem. Where were we, sir?
Well, let's just go through the checklist that doctors have to do to the information or the paperwork that has to be at Pheasants Forever Inc. for them to be eligible for liability coverage.
Got it.
Okay. So there's a one pager that's a prescribed burn policy. That doesn't have anything to do with our manual. That was just basically a one pager for people at least have an idea of kind of the broad things that we're asking. And that's important. But the other thing that has to come in is the 2 people that have 130, 190 have to get their certificates into PF Inc. along with the prescribed burn authorization form. And that authorization form, again, asks about who's certified. It asks for the number of people on the fire crew. It might even ask for names of them. And as a chapter, you might have a dozen people that are working on fire, and maybe only 6 of them show up at any one time. But just list them all so that everybody's covered. That certificate and the information about who's got the training is the most important. Getting in the prescribed burn form is next. And it goes right along with the first one. We have it's not a go, no-go list. It's a pre-burn checklist that needs to be filled out and sent in at some time. It's a pre-burn checklist, so you don't send it in with the authorization form. But the pre-burn checklist is supposed to go to PF also. And that is a checklist that you read off or talk with everybody in the crew before the fire. It just has things in it that you need to remember to talk with the crew about. Make sure the crew's aware of it. They know what the burn plan is. They know what the action plan is. They have an idea of what the plan is if something goes wrong. And then a lot of other things just about the nature of the plot that you're burning on, and making sure that, humidity is correct and that you're checking wind speed and all the things that you need to check before you start that fire. And that needs to go in there also.
And I, for those of you listening, I put all three of those forms in the chat, and I sent it to everybody, so you should be able to access that from here. If you can't, for some reason, download it out of the chat, get a hold of your regional representative. We can get it over to you. Matt can certainly get it over to you as well, but we're here to help for that. But those 3 docs are in the chat.
So the other thing is to realize that every spring, I will have an hour call with a chapter who needs to get a fire done and they don't have anybody qualified to do it. And I can't give them permission to go do that fire. They're not going to get liability insurance through PF. I know that that's not great, but it's kind of, we don't have much, we don't ask for a lot from these chapters, but when we have to have that to be able to have liability coverage. The prescribed burn form, you need to put a date on that form of when the fire is going to occur. It doesn't have to be on that date, but if you're planning on burning on May 1st, you want to burn that site some place darn close to May 1st. That's okay, but you do have to include that in on the prescribed burn authorization plan. It's just expected date of the fire, things like that. You don't have to send in a burn plan to PF, but you need to know where that burn plan is at. Sometimes we'll have chapters that'll take them to the NRCS office and make sure they're on file with the landowner. There might be other situations where they're held somewhere, maybe a person who signs off on the burn plan with the state or USDA. You need to know where that burn plan is and be able to tell us where that burn plan is at.
You mentioned sending it in. It says so at least on one of these forms. And if you want to go through them, Matt, feel free to share your screen if you've got them on your side. But insurance@pheasantsforever.org. That's the best address to send them. Or
to Tim Zemke. To Tim Zemke.
Yeah, and so that
Tim Zemke is yeah.
Right. That site's linked to his email as well.
Yeah.
So, it sounds like I've got a couple of folks here that say that the forms are not in the chat. Can I get anybody able to see them? They're showing up on my screen. If not, I can try to do this again. Feel free to jump in the chat if you see.
Okay, the forms are also, we'll tell them where they're at too. They're in the chapter portal, so chapter should be able to get at that if they can get into their portal.
They are, yeah. Perfect. No forms. Well, I'll make sure to do that. Otherwise, they are in the chapter portal, and your regional rep can certainly can get them to you as well. And we'll get the forms out. That's not that big of a deal. So we've got things covered. Obviously the big thing is we want to make sure that we're doing this the right way, right, Matt? And getting the correct liability insurance through Pheasants Forever. So we've got folks are trained up. We've got the right equipment bought. We've got the forms there. Is there anything else that we're missing here that, as I go back to my original anecdote, just a chapter that's sitting around their local diner having a meeting and they want to start this up because they're hearing from their local community, we need more fire on the landscape.
It gets down to, the other stuff is getting down to experience. Even when we hired habitat specialists to do fire, a lot of times they did not do a fire on their own with their own crew, without somebody else helping out that was very experienced. And a lot of times we did that for 2 years before we let them even go out on their own. And that's just, a safety measure, making sure that they understand or have the experience with a lot of different situations. I'll say another thing that relates to chapters is that I see chapters because you can imagine folks are working during the day and they go out in the spring in the evening and burn in the evening and at night. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a great way to be able to do fire, but you better be very aware of your surroundings and what that field looks like. Because you can imagine in the pitch dark, as much light that the fire gives off, and it's really only giving off a lot of light, you know, where that head fire is or where the main fire is going on. It can get dang black out there, and you know, little hazards can cause a lot of problems out there. So be aware of that. And I'd say I would not start off my fire crew by doing night burns. I'd burn for a couple of years really before I started doing that. Although we've been involved with it a lot, whether it's a fire that's just lasting longer and we go into the evening, or you know, the humidity comes up, the fire kind of lays down a little bit. It's not a bad way to do it, but it can be extremely dangerous if you're not careful. And so I just caution people, it sounds great, but you better be ready for it. Another thing I'll bring up is, again, happens once in a while, where we get good, well-meaning folks who are trying to start their own business doing prescribed fire. And what they hear Pheasants Forever's got liability insurance, and they want to team up with the chapter. We can't let that happen. I mean, we look into that stuff and make sure that if this is a deal that the chapter's doing, it's got to be the chapter, and we can't be subsidizing, you know, a potential small business, as good as that is, and we need those people out there. We can't do their liability insurance for them. All right, so to get a little bit to the scare the heck out of them thing, if that prescribed burn authorization form isn't sent in, and if something would go wrong, if the fire had escaped, and I know the people on the line, you know, if they haven't been involved with it, they've heard about it before, that, you know, the fire breaks the line, goes in, there's a landowner next door that's got a bunch of nice 7-year-old conifers really starting to just take hold and do well, and the fire burns up some of those up. Well, you know, those $300 to $400 trees sitting there suddenly become $1,500, $2,000 trees. And we're not gonna, you know, they don't have any liability. And that liability, when they name that, it's not necessarily on the burn boss, you know, it'll be everybody that's on that fire crew that night. And so just be aware of that. I mean, they can go after everybody if they want to. And in this world of litigation, that's not unheard of. It is an extremely scary situation. I mean, we've been involved with it. When it comes to prescribed fire, it's not a matter of when something happens. It's just, you know, that more than likely it's going to happen. The more fire you burn, sooner or later, something's going to go wrong. And you need to be very conscious of that. And, you know, some of my best guys that are as solid as a rock when it comes to prescribed fire have had escapes that, you know, scared the hell out of them, and scared the heck out of us, because we didn't know for sure, you know, for a while, what kind of damage was involved there.
So just to be clear there, you know, obviously this is a huge responsibility, right? I mean, I've heard many stories. We've had to deal with this a lot. Like, this is, you know, prescribed fire in general in the landscape is no joke and should be taken serious. If they have these forms, they filled them out correctly, they've checked all the boxes, they've submitted them early to insurance@pheasantsforever.org, and something happens, they're going to be okay. Yeah, right. That's your point. Is we need to check these boxes in order to, you know, for our insurance to cover the chapter's work on the landscape.
Right. And where I've used it to scare chapters who aren't complying with it is, if I can find out somebody who's on that burn crew who doesn't know about this, I'll go remind them that they're liable if PF's not covering them, and that usually shuts things down. That might seem a little cold, but I'm more worried about a disaster than I am one fire. I'm answering a question. We got somebody from Minnesota who writes 10 or 12 burn plans a year and sends them in to Tim. I would answer that by saying, thank you very much. That's a very good thing to do. And we're rewriting our whole Pheasants Forever prescribed burn manual over again this winter. And that could become an issue where we do have to do that. And so I think keep doing what you're doing. That's good. As Tim's got those, that's just all that much easier when we get to that. If we get to that point, that we've got that burn plan on hand.
Love it. And then it sounds like the chat's a little fuzzy, but basically if you scroll up, my forms are there. If for some reason they're not there, I went to the chapter resource portal. I logged in as a chapter, and I went to the document center and insurance forms. And the top 3 documents underneath insurance forms are the burn checklist, the authorization form, and the policy. So if you're not familiar with the chapter resource portal, get with your regional rep. They'll make sure to get you there. Lon, you raised your hand, but we can't hear you. So if you've got a question, type it in the Q&A section. And got a couple more minutes here. I don't ever anticipate going the full hour, but
Keaton sent a Q&A in about that they've had luck working with their RC&D. The RC&D even found money for them to buy equipment. I mean, that's a perfect example of working with those other local partners to make this happen. I mean, that's fantastic. We're lucky in Iowa to have county conservation boards. They've been a big help at times with us, but RC&D, if you can find that money, there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes even county or city foundations have helped with fire equipment. Both fortunate and unfortunate, fire has been a big part of our news over the last five years for sure, 10 years probably, but people are aware of it. And when you sell them on the idea that you're buying safety equipment to help the county out, I should also say the volunteer fire departments can also be a big help. Be a little careful. I would say treat the volunteer fire department with professionalism, because we've had a few cases where the volunteer fire department's got all these younger people who are just dying to get out there and fight fire, and they go and get on these crews and help, and then the local community says, hey, we want those folks here so that if there's a fire in town, we don't want them traipsing all over the county doing other work when they're supposed to be working for us. Well, we can get by that a little bit by saying that we're giving them the experience that they're begging for. But in a lot of cases, volunteer fire departments can help you out in both volunteers to help on your fire crew, and I'm not going to say so much equipment because they've got a lot of needs themselves, but sometimes they'll get from the state or from one place or another a lot of Nomex or just the right PPE covering for you as a firefighter, and they may have some of that around to help you out that way.
Perfect. That's an excellent point. Russell reached out and he said, you talked about online training and field day. He's from Wisconsin. Where do I go for online training, and how do I find field day resources? I linked the National Wildfire Coordinating Group website to that. Is that where you'd go for that? I mean, I just Googled it.
You could go to that. The other one would be the Wisconsin Fire Council. Whether you go to the DNR, or I know Wisconsin's got a fire council, and I think they've even got some throughout in different parts of the state. And I think you'll find training information there. Minnesota's got a lot of them. I think Minnesota always has field days, or has days in February and maybe June. Missouri's got a great one in northern Missouri in June. And maybe not northern Missouri, but Missouri, where they've got tons of classes available, and also the quick training for the field days and things like that.
Yeah.
Usually with your state Department of Natural Resources or state Department of Conservation, if you go to prescribed fire, you can find information there, at least a place to start. And a lot of them have a lot of information on it.
Yeah, most definitely. I would say, especially start at your natural resource, whatever. Here it's the DNR, but most folks want more fire on the landscape and are looking for individuals to do so. So hopefully they'll be more than willing to help you out.
Brian Teeter's got a PDF of all the NWCG training and different levels of training. If he just sent that in on Q&A.
If you can figure it out, Brian, throw it in the chat.
Brian just reminds me of this, if you don't mind. Nebraska and Kansas, to some extent, have had real success with these prescribed fire, basically volunteer prescribed fire groups. where this works great with landowners. If landowners have fire that they know they're going to do, they get involved with this group, they work on a few fires, and then they come and do their fire. And it's kind of an agreement that we'll help if you'll come help us. And they've been, usually those groups have all their own equipment, and it's portable, it's in trailers, and they'll move through an area and do fire all summer long. Burn association, local burn associations is what I believe they call them. And if you're lucky enough to have one of those around, I think that NRCS would be able to tell you if there are, and they can be a huge help. I'm going to say one more thing. A lot of chapters go into this with maybe the idea that they can make a lot of money at it. I don't have any problem if chapters make money off of this. In fact, they should. In fact, one of the problems that we have is that chapters in the idea of just being good neighbors and good citizens in their local area will go and do prescribed burns and not charge nearly enough money for what they're doing. What I tell people is sometimes the charges for fire may seem high, but what you're paying for is not only your fire, but those days when that group heads out, sets up for a fire, and the wind's blowing too dang hard, and they got to drive back home, or the humidity drops to nothing, and they've got to stop everything and pull out. It is an expensive form of work when you really put all the money together. The folks on the phone that familiar with Minnesota know that Dennis Peterson did a lot of fire for us as a habitat specialist for many years up in the Montevideo area. And he actually put together a whole Excel sheet that showed all the charges and why it costs what it does. And I didn't even think that he probably went to a far enough extent, but fire is expensive. Here's the other thing, and this is what happens when we do fire on CRP, is that when we submit a bill to that landowner, it goes into the state, into the big state file. And every year they'll look at the low and the high costs of doing fire, and they'll come up with a cost share. Well, if we're doing stuff for nothing, or 10 or 20 bucks an acre, that's just taking the dang cost share down. And for us to really be effective with fire out there in the landscape, we need more fire, not less. And so if we can get that price to a place where that cost share, where it's reasonable, not only for us to burn, but for those private companies to get out there and be effective, that's really what we need. I mean, there was a time when I was all PF and I wanted to do all the fire myself, and that's just not going to work. And we got to try to help and work as a group with everybody to make fire viable.
Matt, we've got one that's a bit in the weeds. It might need to be answered by our insurance agent, but we're coming here to an end. Is that something you can answer, or is that something that maybe we need to send an email and get that out?
All right, I'm just going to answer a couple here quick. Is any equipment, Ranger sprayer units that is not PF owned, but a local volunteer loans or rents to a PF chapter, that's going to have to be something that you better, if you do that, you better have a pretty good agreement with whoever you work with, because this equipment gets beat up. Our Rangers might only, run, 200 or 300 hours in the spring to do these fires, but there can be a lot of damage on those things after a spring, whether it's tires, whether it's not maintaining those things each day and blowing out the soot and dust that builds up in them. They're around a lot of water and they're around a lot of soot. And so they can get really gummed up and get screwed up over a fire season. So, you can do that, but you better be darn sure on your agreement that you have with the person that you might be renting that equipment from. Another question is, what is a reasonable price? We used to do this when our habitat specialists, we would say that fire was $40 an acre if you took care of the fire breaks. And fire breaks are extremely, extremely important, and they had to be done to our specifications. And we've driven up to burns where that fire break was obviously mowed the day or two before the fire, and we turned around and left until they were right. So otherwise, if we did the fire breaks, then it was $60 an acre. I would say right now, if I was burning right now, I would be charging $45 an acre for a fire if the burn breaks are at our specs and ready to go.
You did it. You answered it all. We went almost a full hour. How about that? Well, Matt, I appreciate you spending an hour with me and a whole bunch of our chapter leaders all across the country. This has been invaluable amount of information, and I think we all certainly learned a lot. And you know, the chapters that are really interested in this realize now that this is an investment. So appreciate you joining. For those of you that have been joining me for these chapter happy hours, only one in October. That may have something to do with it being hunting season here in Minnesota. The next one's November 8th. Jordan Martinchis, our director of development, is going to be joining me with a conversation about Call the Uplands and how chapters and volunteers can participate. So in the meantime, thanks for joining me.
Well, one other thing, if anybody comes up with any other questions, it's M. O'Connor, MOCONNOR at pheasantsforever.org. If they want to send me an email and ask more questions, I'm good with that.
You bet. And if you didn't write that down fast enough, get a hold of your regional representative and we'll connect you guys up. No problem. In the meantime, invite somebody new to join your chapter and we'll see you in November. Take care, everybody.